We begin this morning with President Trump posting again about Jeffrey Epstein. Last night, he asked when the DOJ will say, quote, no more on the Epstein files and work on election fraud, claiming, quote, the Dems are the ones who worked with Epstein, not the Republicans. Release all of their names, embarrass them, and get back to helping our country. This from the man who is in picture after picture after picture and video with the man in question. The post follows an incoherent Christmas Day rant where he posted, quote, Merry Christmas to all, including the many sleazebags who loved Jeffrey Epstein, only to drop him like a dog when things got too hot. Falsely claimed they had nothing to do with him, didn't know him, said he was a disgusting person, and then blamed, of course, President Donald J. Trump. He also added a cryptic warning saying, quote, that's the way it is in the world of corrupt Democrat politics. Enjoy what may be your last Merry Christmas. It's the president, of course. And that was just one of the nearly 150 times Trump posted in an unhinged rage-baiting spree on Christmas Day, in which he once again peddled 2020 election conspiracy theories, wished a Merry Christmas to everyone, including the, quote, radical left scum, and shared false claims about Somali immigrants. Joining us now is Kayla Gardner, MS Now White House reporter, Kimberly Atkins-Storer, MS Now political analyst and columnist for the Boston Globe and writer of the Supreme Court newsletter, The Gavel, and David Drucker, MS Now contributor, senior writer for The Dispatch, and author of In Trump's Shadow. Kayla, I gotta start with you. Now, 150 times on one day. The man tweets or tells someone else to tweet a lot. But it seems with the way that, as long as I've covered him, as long as you've covered him, as long as he's been in our lives, the thing that has been very clear is when Trump is feeling like his back is against the wall, that's when we start seeing this. When he's scared and worried, that's what he starts seeing this. How is the White House kind of taking in and explaining these rage-baiting
One thing that I thought was so interesting, particularly about his Epstein comments, is just a few days ago, he was saying he felt terrible for people like Bill Clinton being in these photos and sort of expressing sympathy for people who had association with Jeffrey Epstein, including himself, who had more than a decade-long friendship with Epstein. And so that seemed to sharply change. Now he's again putting that attention back on Democrats, which has been the White House's strategy from the beginning. They say, look at these other people who had relationships with Epstein. Look at Congress. They don't want the attention to be on President Trump. But to his point about the DOJ focusing on other things, they are not going to be. The DOJ has explicitly said the next few weeks will be committed to looking through these documents, making new redactions. So this is a story that is not going to go away for the White House, especially going into the new year. And it's largely a problem of their own making. This is something that they could have been doing from day one. President Trump said that he was going to release the Epstein files. This is a problem that they have walked into. And it seems that some of the loudest voices that are upset are Trump's own supporters. So it's a political issue of his own making. And there's a lot that could have been done leading up to this moment to really avoid the problems that they're seeing now.
It's important to note that Donald Trump himself was a Democrat when he was hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. So while he's pointing fingers at the Democrat, he himself was a Democrat at that point. Molly.
I'm curious. I wanted to reach out to you, David. So we have seen this has really spiraled, this Epstein story. It just continues to go on. Republicans have had really some bad special elections, right? It's, you know, there's been a lot of sort of mess ups. I wonder, you know, are Republicans starting to get nervous? Do you see any kind of feeling or a talk at all behind the scenes that there's that Trump may in fact not be the sort of, you know, that he may be in fact a paper tiger?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, I think clearly people are starting to talk and act according to the fact that Trump's not going to be president forever, no matter what some of his supporters might prefer. And so you're starting to see conversations and actions that tell you that they're preparing for a post-Trump future, whatever that means. I don't think that we've seen any substantial evidence that they're throwing him overboard and treating him like a lame duck. Perhaps that's something that is going to happen later this summer or after the midterm elections. But Molly, as you know, the Republican primaries are just around the corner. I mean, you know, if I got a nickel for every time I said this, I'd be in pretty good shape. The president's relationship with Republican voters, even though the polling shows that it's diminished some, is still very solid. Republican primary candidates are still aggressively seeking the president's endorsement. because it still appears that that endorsement could make or break a primary candidate's prospects. And I don't think anybody is going to push him away or do anything that shows a real break with him, at least until after the primaries are over. Maybe this fall we'll begin to see some separation as they look ahead to the general election. But of course, that depends on what district you're in or what state you're in. If you're running in a red state for Senate, if you're running in a red district for the House of Representatives, you're not going to break with the president ahead of the general election. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen in a purple state, in a competitive swing district. But of course, we would see that anyway. So I think people need to slow their roll if they think they're seeing a crack up. I think we're seeing cracks,
right,
but not yet a crack up.
Yeah. Kimberly, I want to look at, and because part of the crack up is the Epstein files, right? That's like Kayla said, that's where a lot of the anger has come from. I want to play Representative Ro Khanna, who was on our colleagues' show yesterday, All In with Chris Hayes, talking about this 1 million files that the DOJ announced were, quote, uncovered.
They said there was nothing more to see. The case is closed. And then, whoops, there are 1 million more files. Anyone who has talked to the survivors or the survivors' lawyers knows that there are critical documents that people should see. What are those documents? They should see the survivors' interviews with the FBI where they named other names. The survivors' lawyers have been in those interviews. They should release the thousands of emails on Jeffrey Epstein's computer that were seized in 2019.
He's throwing out a lot of things that he wants to see. We probably all want to see. But I also am curious, do you think that Congress is doing enough to make sure that the DOJ is doing what they are required by law to do? They already broke the law because the law required them to release everything within that 30 days it was 11:59 on the 19th.
Right.
That did not happen. So we're already past that. Is Congress doing enough? There's no teeth. There's nothing. They don't have a police force to go arrest folks.
Well, they have something that is called inherent contempt.
Yeah, tell people what that is, because that's
I know
what
people have. Yes, that people have been talking about that. So there are different types of contempt that Congress can hold people in. They can ask courts to either hold them in civil or criminal contempt in a way that the courts would enforce it. But there's also something called inherent contempt, which allows them literally to send their sergeant at arms to go bring someone in to appear before Congress or to order them to do something like produce documents. That is an archaic power that was really meant to allow the government to be set up. Like before the courts were in place, Congress had to be able to do its job. I'm not sure that is even necessary here because we do have courts. And for the most part, especially trial and appellate level courts, have been standing up and fulfilling their job as a check on the other branches of government. But this is a problem of the Trump administration's own making. Donald Trump signed that bill into law on November 19th. So this is really the Justice Department. I can't tell at this point if it's misfeasance, just incompetence, or malfeasance, just them trying to cover their tracks and just protect Trump. I'm guessing it's probably a bit of both in that they can't get these documents out. But the point that Representative Khanna made is so important is that you have survivors. First of all, that should be top of mind for everyone.
All the time.
That's what this is about. Finding out what happened, who is responsible if there are co-conspirators, and making sure it doesn't happen again. And the survivors who have spoken out can paint the trail for them. We don't need to be going through all this machinations and finding these documents that, I don't know, the Easter Bunny or somebody suddenly dropped and they just saw. There is a path to get to the bottom of this, and there seems to be a real lack of urgency or desire by DOJ to actually do that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this CNN reporting about the Epstein messaging being frustrated. Trump world being frustrated with the Epstein messaging. David, maybe you could talk about this. I mean, it does seem like the Trump administration has done a pretty bad job with the Epstein information, and they always knew it was coming.
Let him get up! I'm stuck!
If there's one political issue that defined 2025, it would be immigration. President Trump campaigned on the promise of closing the borders and restricting legal immigration.
All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
And immediately after Trump took office, ICE started carrying out raids in sanctuary cities and detaining tens of thousands of people around the country.
You're seeing grandmas, you're seeing children, you're seeing families, you're seeing business owners, you're seeing people who are just standing in line waiting to go to work, being snatched out of those lines, hauled off by men in masks, never to be heard from again, presumably.
The scene playing out again and again throughout the year.
Multiple large Border Patrol agents holding down one landscape worker.
PhD student and Fulbright scholar at Tufts University was taken off a residential street in Somerville, Massachusetts.
New Yorkers rallied for this 6-year-old boy who Trump's immigration agents took away from his father.
I covered the story of Nori Santai Ramos and her mother, Estela, who were deported to Guatemala after being detained at an immigration check-in appointment in Los Angeles. They had been there for weeks when I went there to visit them.
You're praying a lot?
Yes. I pray every single day to be able to have an opportunity to go back.
Nori's mother ultimately died in Guatemala 2 months after being sent there, leaving Nori to navigate life on her own. In June, the National Guard was deployed to Los Angeles by President Trump to respond to protests against federal immigration raids. California Senator Alex Padilla was forcefully removed from a press conference there after he tried to question Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem about methods of immigration enforcement in his state.
Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you don't my hands, go ahead, stand behind my back.
All right, cool. One hand, lay flat, lay flat.
And LA was only the first of the Democratic-led cities to be targeted by the National Guard. They were also sent to Washington, D.C., Chicago, Portland, Oregon, and Memphis, Tennessee. There were also 2 high-profile court cases involving immigrants, Mahmoud Khalil, who was detained despite being in the U.S. legally, and Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported to El Salvador despite a judge's order.
Their stories have become flashpoints in a much larger struggle over who we are as a nation and who we are becoming.
Mahmoud Khalil was a Columbia University graduate student and legal U.S. resident who was apprehended at his home and separated from his pregnant wife by ICE agents in what supporters call an illegal arrest.
The moment that ICE apprehend you, you don't have any rights. You're expected to follow orders, not to know anything.
They say he was targeted for speaking out about his pro-Palestinian viewpoint and advocating for an end to the war in Gaza. Once in custody, the Department of Homeland Security transferred Khalil to an ICE processing center in Louisiana, where he was held for 104 days until a federal judge ordered his release.
The Trump administration admits to an administrative error when it deported a man living in Maryland with protected legal status to the mega prison in El Salvador.
Abrego was deported in March back to his home country and immediately imprisoned there, despite a 2019 court order blocking his removal. His attorneys say he had permission to work in the U.S. The Trump administration eventually brought him back, but charged him with 2 counts of human smuggling, for which he has pled not guilty. His case continues to work its way through the courts, and a judge recently ordered his release from detention.
I stand here today with my head held up high.
In response to the thousands of encounters all year, some people have started pushing back against ICE.
The Home Depot in Manhattan, in New York City, filled up with people shouting in the aisles about standing with immigrants. ICE out of Home Depot.
In some areas, community organizers even started programs to teach residents how to protect themselves or others from ICE agents.
What's the most important thing that you've taken away from being at these trainings and actually being out in the field in the face of the Border Patrol being here?
I think obviously watching someone literally being detained, but I felt like our presence and the way that the rest of the folks in the parking lot at the grocery store where we were located, the community coming together prevented that from being executed. They let him go.
They let him go. They let him go. 2025 comes to a close with uncertainty for so many immigrants, but also with some hope, thanks to communities who are stepping up to help their neighbors. Jacob Soboroff, MS Now.
Joining us now, we have Dave Ehrenberg, former state attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida, where the first complaint against Epstein was filed back in 1996. So, Dave, is there anything at all that still hasn't been released that could come in this 1 million files that the DOJ just happened to uncover?
Britt, what everyone is looking for are the names of the unindicted co-conspirators. We haven't seen that. We did see a mention of 10 co-conspirators, and they were redacted with the exception of 3, including Leslie Wexner, where we don't know why his name was unredacted. We know why the others were unredacted, like Ghislaine Maxwell. She's been convicted already. Jean-Luc Brunel, who committed suicide in a jail cell in France. He was charged with Epstein-related crimes. But why were the others redacted? We don't know. Why are some of the documents redacted in full, entire pages being redacted, while others just have names redacted? So it seems like it's haphazard what we're going through, what we're seeing right now. And I do think we're going to see more revelations. It's a drip, drip, drip. That's a self-inflicted wound by this president, because instead of just ripping the Band-Aid off and just releasing them all at the same time, we're now seeing this gradual rollout, which is out of context, which a lot of times doesn't make much sense, but is pretty damning in the court of public opinion.
And to that point, one drop came in the middle of the night this week. But the public documents already contradict claims like this one made in 2024, January 2024 to be exact, by Trump. He said he was never on Epstein's plane or at his, quote, stupid island. An email from a prosecutor says flight records actually showed Trump listed as a passenger on at least 8 flights between 1993 and 1996. In fact, one flight apparently lists Trump and Epstein as the only 2 passengers. On another, the passengers were Epstein, Trump, and a 20-year-old whose name was redacted. But Trump spent Christmas Day unleashing a rant that was anything but merry and bright, addressing, quote, sleazebags who loved Jeffrey Epstein, gave him bundles of money, went to his island, attended his parties, and thought he was the greatest guy on the earth. Now, the president goes on to say he was the only one to drop Epstein. But, Dave, how do you square these clearly 2 competing narratives?
Yeah, Trump clearly hates that we're talking about this, and he's lashing out. You're right. It wasn't exactly joy to the world or peace on earth as a Christmas message. Remember, he's the one who signed the act into law. He's the one who urged Republicans to vote for it after telling them to vote against it. So one thing to keep in mind is you correctly noted that none of this proves that President Trump committed any crimes. But he doesn't want us talking about it. He doesn't want there to be any smoke out there. And I mentioned that this plays poorly in the court of public opinion. None of this would play in a court of law because it's hearsay, and you have to have first-hand knowledge of this kind of stuff. And again, there's no indication that Trump committed a crime. But calling it a Democratic hoax has not worked. It's only going to inflame the survivors who have really found their voice of late. And you could say this will embarrass Democrats, but so far we've seen lots of mentions of Trump and Steve Bannon and even Elon Musk. But I think the biggest loser in all this, Britt, is Ghislaine Maxwell. She continues to profess her innocence, but this revelation here, these releases, show a predator who not only enabled but participated in these activities. And she was the one who was moved into a minimum security prison where sex offenders are not supposed to be. That was done not by Democrats, but by this administration.
Now, we should also mention the DOJ says some documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims against President Trump, adding, quote, to be clear, the claims are unfounded and false. Among one of those claims is this right here. This allegation filed in a civil complaint against Epstein's estate and Ghislaine Maxwell back in 2020. The victim says she was 13 when she met Epstein at a summer camp in Michigan and 14 when he introduced her to Trump, elbowing Trump playfully and asking, quote, this is a good one, right? Well, she claims Trump smiled and nodded in agreement. Many of these complaints were settled out of court, and we have no way, we should point this out, we have no way of verifying if this particular claim is true. But can the president now plausibly deny he knew what Epstein was engaged in at the time, Dave?
He could say that none of this stuff has been corroborated and that this was taken out of context, and you can't even believe this is hearsay within hearsay and would never be allowed in a court of law. But, Britt, as I said earlier, it just doesn't look good in a court of public opinion. It's a reason why Trump wants this controversy to be over. He doesn't want to be talking about this. He doesn't want his name to be mentioned in the same sentence as Jeffrey Epstein. And he knows that this could hurt him politically because his base wants to find out the truth. This is one thing that the base is not relenting on. You know, you can tell them the election was stolen and don't provide proof. This is something where if you tell them that it's a Democratic hoax, they're not going to believe it because they've been led to believe that these files will be released in full and we'll get to see it all. And they have not been released in full, and we have not seen it all yet.
And one way to end the conversation quickly is just to release all the documents. Dave Ehrenberg, thank you. We'll see you soon.
You're watching a special hour of Velshi, the world according to Trump. President Donald Trump grabbed more headlines on the world stage in 2025 than he did during his entire first term in office. Early on, he launched into a global trade war by announcing double and triple-digit tariff increases on almost all imports. None of the United States' traditional trading partners have been spared, neither China nor Canada. On his first trip abroad to the Middle East, Trump solicited hundreds of billions of dollars in investment pledges from the Saudis. He accepted a $400 million jumbo jet gifted to him by Qatar. He's both escalated regional tensions by ordering airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites and attempted to de-escalate tensions by persuading Israel to pause the fighting in Gaza after 2 years of war. He's pursued an end to Russia's war on Ukraine, first by scolding Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House, then by holding a summit in Alaska with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and always by threatening to cut the Ukrainians off unless they give in to Russian demands. Finally, Trump appears to be gearing up for war with Venezuela. He's deployed a naval armada off its coast and ordered boat strikes in the Caribbean Sea. Trump has marked his first year back on the global stage by engaging the world with an unpredictable mix of instinct, grievance, and ego. But let's start with international trade. Since returning to office, President Donald Trump has unleashed an unsparing global trade war, dramatically hiking tariffs on allies and rivals alike. They've been rolled out so chaotically that in April, while announcing tariffs on almost every nation on Earth, Trump slapped tariffs on, quote, a group of barren, uninhabited volcanic islands near Antarctica, covered in glaciers and home to penguins, end quote. Even the penguins were not spared. Trump has spent the months since then haphazardly changing tariff rates as our trading partners around the world do their best to negotiate and mitigate damage to their own economies. Tariffs imposed on China have caused Chinese exports to the United States to drop by nearly a fifth, according to the Commerce Department. Nevertheless, China announced a trade surplus with the world that hit over $1 trillion. That's a new record. China previously was a top buyer of U.S. soybeans, but in the spring, it stopped purchasing American soybeans because the trade war launched by Donald Trump resulted in huge losses for U.S. farmers. Some Chinese purchases of U.S. soybeans resumed following an October trade agreement, and Trump just announced $12 billion in bailouts to help American soybean farmers weather the storm. Trump's trade war has even antagonized our neighbors to the north. He broke off negotiations and threatened even steeper tariffs on trade with Canada after the province of Ontario ran a TV ad here in the United States with stock footage of Ronald Reagan arguing against tariffs. Canada's prime minister has since said that Canada's special relationship with America is now over. Some world leaders have learned that the key to negotiating with Trump is to lead with extravagant gifts, like a gold Rolex desk clock and a $130,000 engraved gold bar that Trump was given by a group of Swiss billionaires before he decided to cut tariffs on Switzerland, or a golden crown gifted to Trump by South Korea's president before he cut tariffs on that country. Trump's constant back and forth on tariffs even resulted in a new acronym entering the lexicon, TACO, which stands for Trump Always Chickens Out. Some market analysts use the term to describe a phenomenon that's happened repeatedly in the last year, in which Trump announces a new tariff, the market reacts negatively, and Trump then backs away or cuts the previously announced rate. But while TACO makes for a pithy catchphrase, the impacts are real. Trump's tariff policy has resulted in increased economic uncertainty around the world. The tit-for-tat tariffs between America and its trading partners are expected to slow global economic growth for 2025 to just 3.2%. According to the World Bank, that's, quote, below the post-pandemic average and among the weakest since 2008. Joining me now is Mohamed El-Erian. He is the former deputy director of the International Monetary Fund. He's the chief economic advisor at Allianz, which is a multinational financial services company, and a great friend. Great to have you back here. Thank you.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't want to give you a thesis because you watch all of this closely. What's the most important takeaway for my viewer as we end this first year of the Trump administration?
I think there are two takeaways, Ali. First, that the U.S. upended conventional wisdom, not just internationally, but domestically. And then the second is that the damage to the U.S. economy and the damage to the global economy was less than most economists forecast, which poses the question, what's going to happen next? So round one was one of massive upheaval to the economic order. And yet, somehow, both the U.S. economy and the global economy navigated it well. question is, what about round two?
So, as a global economist, you understand the flow of money and investment, and there's always been a relationship between being secure and stable and predictable as a country versus not. We have entered the realm of being less predictable. How big a deal is that?
It's a big deal, but people are distinguishing between sovereign U.S., unpredictable, and corporate U.S., innovative and productive. So, for example, you see massive amount of money coming into the U.S. to invest in the stock market. People want to take a bet on U.S. companies, but they're hedging the dollar. Right. Because the dollar is viewed to be the sovereign side. So the rest of the world has said, you know what, I cannot predict sovereign U.S., but I'm willing to bet on corporate U.S.
How big a deal is the weakening of the dollar? There are some experts who thought there would be some benefit in weakening the dollar a bit.
So there are some benefits, but there's something else going on, and that has been inspired by Russia. When Russia was precluded from the dollar trading system, most economists, most countries expected Russian trade to collapse. It hasn't. Russia has come up with an alternative trading system that completely bypasses the dollar. Now remember, we are the reserve currency, so this notion that you could build pipes around us is not a good idea. And I can tell you, when I travel around the world, people ask me, how did Russia do it? Because they did not expect Russia to be able to navigate a world without the dollar.
Right. If you freeze them out, the expectation would be that Russia would collapse financially.
Correct. And the other thing we're seeing is that foreign central banks are buying gold. Gold has gone from record to record. At the margin, they are replacing dollar reserves with gold reserves. Now, you can't replace dollar reserve with another currency because we may not be perfect, but we're better than the others. Right. But you're seeing them buy at the margin more gold.
Let's talk about tariffs. This year has caused us to get into two corners on tariffs. Donald Trump says it's the most beautiful word in the English language. It's neither the most beautiful nor the ugliest. It's simply a tool, right? You can't have a toolbox that only has hammers in it. It's a tool. What's your sense of what we should be doing as it relates to tariffs and trade?
So the reason why economists warn against overusing this tool, which the U.S. has, is because it tends to trigger retaliation. So we end up in what's known as a trade war. Right. And you end up in what's known in economics as beggar thy neighbor. I'll make you poorer, you make me poorer, and we're both worse off. The big surprise is, with the exception of Brazil and India, most economies have not retaliated against the U.S. Most economies said, you know what, in round one, you can have what you want in the U.S. The risk is we overuse that tool. And that is a big risk, because not only have we weaponized tariffs, we've also weaponized investment sanctions.
Have you been able to establish what effect the tariffs so far have had on inflation?
So the conventional wisdom is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 of the increase in prices due to tariffs has been borne by us, the consumers. Right. 1/3 has been borne by the exporters, and 1/3 have been borne by the importing company that sells to us. So in the beginning, the pass-through, how much ended up with us facing it when we go to the store, has been a lot less than people expected. The expectation is you're going to see more pass-through in the year ahead.
Because the uncertainty meant that some companies said, let me take a bit of the hit here and we'll figure this out.
Correct.
By next year, they might say, all right, we've got a tariff and our cars cost more or our lumber costs more.
Yeah, absolutely right. Put it simply, if you don't know whether the tariff is going to stick, why anger your consumer?
Right.
Hold on, because you don't want to distance your consumer. So that was the reaction. But if the tariffs stick, then the companies are going to start protecting their margin and are going to pass through more to the consumer.
One of the reasons for imposing these tariffs has been to rebuild the American manufacturing economy. And there are some people who criticize that thinking, saying we're sort of fetishizing America as that manufacturing economy that we remember, where we made socks and furniture and bicycles. What's your take on that?
So at the margin, we will attract some industries back. But you can't both want to reshore, which means bring in, and you want to collect lots of tariff revenues for the budget. Where this has worked is tariff revenues. We've collected about $200 billion of tariff revenues, and that has helped the fiscal side. I think people at the end of the day are going to say, you know what, it worked for revenue, not so much for reshoring industry.
What's your sense of where this goes?
So a lot depends on whether the U.S. can freeze the situation or whether the U.S. will continue to use tariffs, almost every month. What economists will tell you is that you cannot turn tariffs into variables. because the trading system needs a certain amount of predictability.
Right.
Companies need a certain amount of predictability. If not, what you do is countries will step back and say, you know what, we'll do less. And then you end up with low economic growth. So the key issue is that the U.S. isn't inclined to have another year in which it changes tariff levels almost every month.
Mohamed, I'm always smarter for talking to you. Thank you, and it's great to see you in person.
Thank you for having me.
Mohamed El-Erian is the Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz, and he is a former Deputy Director of the International Monetary Fund.
Let's continue this conversation with MS Now International Affairs analyst Michael McFaul. He served as U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration. But also with us right now, we have New York Times White House correspondent Luke Broadwater. Thank you to you both. Ambassador McFaul, let's start with you. Overnight, Russia attacked Kyiv and other cities with hundreds of missiles and drones, as we saw from that video. What message is the Kremlin trying to send the West ahead of tomorrow's talks?
Well, it's a message that they want to conquer Ukraine. They want Ukraine to submit. President Putin also gave some remarks about an hour ago where he said very clearly, I want all of Donbass, and if they won't give it to me through negotiation, I'm going to take it by force. So I appreciate the effort that has gone into this new 20-point deal that President Zelensky wants to speak to President Trump about. There are real compromises there, especially major compromises on the Ukrainian side. This is a new set of ideas that are in this plan, but it's just clear to me, unless there's some hidden back channel to Putin that we don't know about, he's not interested at all. He just wants to keep fighting until he conquers all of Donbass. And I think he wants to actually subjugate all of Ukraine, not just Donbass. Tragically, we're nowhere near, I don't think we're nowhere near a deal today than we were just a year ago.
And Luke, to that point, President Trump has been vowing to end Russia's war in Ukraine, going back to him saying that he's going to do it on day one, right? 11 months later, though, what major obstacles stand in the way of reaching this deal?
Well, I mean, the major obstacle is Putin. The president has not really been willing to stand up to Putin through his time in office. He's shown much more leeway towards the Russian president than American predecessors. It does seem to me that these strikes are about trying to change the realities on the battlefield ahead of the finalizing of any plan. They know if they can get the lines of battle moved some, that perhaps they can seize more territory through the negotiations. And we have seen a willingness on the American side to bless the idea that land seized by Russia would now be Russia's as part of the negotiations. So Putin has seen, I guess you could say, some success in the fact that he's taking land through military force, and then one consideration in the peace deals is letting him have some of that land.
Ambassador McFaul, what does it tell you that Zelensky is now coming back to the U.S. to hold talks with Trump? Is this, something to be optimistic about?
Well, there are lots of people in Ukraine and even foreign policy advisors here in the United States who say it's a mistake. What are you doing? He hasn't offered anything. To the point you were just discussing, the United States appears ready to acknowledge annexation through conquest, imperial conquest, as something we're ready to live with. But I think President Zelensky has no choice. I think he's decided that without keeping the Americans engaged, this war is likely to go on longer, and he needs the United States to stay at least somewhat engaged on the Ukrainian side and not go full 100% on the side of the Russians. And I think that's what he's trying to accomplish in this trip.
And Luke, you kind of talked about this earlier, and even earlier this year, Trump accused Putin of, quote, tapping us along during peace talks. But is there any indication at all that Russia is actually open to a peace deal at this point?
I mean, maybe if they get everything they want, if they get all the land, perhaps Putin will stop there. What I'm interested in is what is Russia giving up, right? And maybe it's just that they stop fighting, and maybe that's enough for Ukraine and for the Americans. It seems like that would be enough for Donald Trump. He wants to say he stopped another war. a big one. He's ended the killing. And if that means that Russia was rewarded for seizing territory, so be it. He got the peace deal he long sought. But I think to the ambassador's point, is Putin willing to stop there? Is he happy with just the Donbas? Or does he want all of Ukraine? Does he want even more of Europe? There's a lot of things he's written over the years about wanting to reconstitute the old Soviet Union. So, if he is rewarded for aggression here, does he stop in Ukraine?
So, Ambassador McFaul, can you answer that? I mean, how much is Russia giving up? And here's the big question. What if they give up nothing?
Well, to date, they've given up nothing. To the best of my knowledge, again, maybe there's some secret deal we don't know about, but in the public domain, Putin has not given one single concession through all these negotiations with President Trump, Special Envoy Witkoff. It's all been on the Ukrainian side. They meet with Putin, they say, here's what we want, and then they go back to Washington and they demand it from President Zelensky. And I think the critical strategic mistake in 2025 is that President Trump thought that he could appease Putin, listen to what he wanted and give it to him, and he would stop fighting. And that hasn't worked. And so what they need to do, if they really want to achieve an end to this war, is they need more weapons to the Ukrainians and more sanctions to the Russians to put pressure on Putin. Because right now he's feeling no pressure whatsoever from the United States of America.
And I want to follow up on that, Ambassador. How concerning is this back and forth, and how risky is it even?
I think it's very risky. I think it makes Putin believe that if he just keeps to his guns, literally to his guns, he will succeed. This time around, if you look closely at the proposal that Zelensky is negotiating, there's more concessions there for Vladimir Putin. And so from Putin's vantage point, if he just keeps fighting, we negotiate among ourselves and he keeps getting a better and better deal. I just think that logic has to change. If there's going to be a negotiation, there has to be more pressure on Russia, the Russian economy, the Russian army, and Putin, not just pressure on President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people.
And Luke, is that pressure even realistic? What are the real expectations coming out of tomorrow's meeting, you think?
Yeah, it's tricky. Steve Witkoff has gone to Russia several times. He's met with Zelensky. Now Zelensky's coming to Mar-a-Lago. The administration's been all over the place in response to Ukraine. At first, Trump had seemingly an anti-Ukraine stance. He dressed Zelensky down in the White House. Then he seemed to be siding with Ukraine, praising Ukraine's heroics on the battlefield and saying he'd grown tired and frustrated of Putin. And so now, which way is the pendulum swinging? What mood is Donald Trump in today? What are his advisors telling him? So we'll learn a lot tomorrow how this meeting goes. Before Trump was talking about giving tomahawks to Ukraine, then he said he wasn't anymore. So he's really oscillated a lot on his stances. Maybe that's a negotiating strategy. I don't know. But because he changes his position so often, it makes it hard to predict how the United States is going to act towards Ukraine. And so we really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
We're going to have to wait and see, but I just thought of a follow-up question for the ambassador here. We should note that you've been face-to-face with Vladimir Putin before in negotiating situations, but going back to the pressure and the risk that we were just talking about, how much will giving up land to him in these negotiations empower him more, especially in the future?
I worry about that. I worry that if he is allowed to annex land, and we acknowledge that, and we say it's okay to invade countries and take their land, we're going to go back to a pre-1945 world, back to World War II, pre-World War II. When World War II, that's what happened. That's why we had that disastrous war. And suddenly it's going to make imperial conquest okay for many countries. So the stakes here are not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of security in all of Europe. Remember, he sent his tanks to Kiev. He didn't send them to Donetsk in 2022. I think a lot of people have forgotten that fact. And if he's not stopped on the battlefield, I think he will continue to pressure and threaten other security European allies. of the United States of America, and that could drag us into a war. So if we want to avoid war with Russia, we should help the Ukrainians defeat the Russian soldiers in their territory now. It's in our national interest to do so today so that we don't have to worry about being threatened by a Russian invasion of a NATO country years down the road.
And Ambassador, to that point, if you take a more of a 360 view of this, what does this mean for NATO countries?
Well, you've heard them all. They've been on calls together. They're trying to show unity. But they, to the best of my knowledge, reading what they've been saying, they want what I'm saying. They understand that if Putin wins in Ukraine, the threats to their countries will be greater. Conversely, if Putin is stopped on the battlefield through a combination of better weapons and sanctions on the Russian economy, that will make the threat from Russia less likely. It's just that simple. And that's why when people say we don't have this is not our war, the vice president said that the other day, I could not disagree more. If Putin wins this war, it creates trouble for our security interests in Europe. If he loses, or at least he's fought to a stalemate, that makes it less likely that we have to get involved in defending our NATO allies on the borders of Russia.
Former Ambassador Michael McFaul and Luke Broadwater, thank you for your time on this Saturday.